Well, before we talk about the comedian drag queen who's now become president of Ukraine, which is a story for the ages, frankly, suggesting that the Russians will lose in Ukraine is tantamount to suggesting that if we intervened in northern Mexico, that we would lose in Mexico. No, we're not going to lose in Mexico. We can't. We're going to do pretty much whatever we want and stay as long as we like. I think that's the case for Russia and eastern Ukraine.
Without further ado, I want to bring on our guest. It's the one, the only former U.S. Army colonel and former Pentagon senior advisor, Douglas Macgregor. We've reacted to numerous of his brilliant, bits of commentary on the ongoing war in Ukraine. So I'm very stoked to have him here today. And here we go. Colonel, how you doing?
Threats today, so I'm in pretty good shape.
Great. Glad to hear that. So listen, we've followed your commentary. We've seen all of your segments on Tucker Carlson. You've been doing an incredible job. I think personally, though, I'm sure you've angered a lot of people in the Beltway. I'm curious first to get your opinion on how things have panned out in your eyes in the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, because we were following what you were saying even back when you were on Pushback with Aaron Mate back in January before all of this took place. And you were one of the only people that I really trusted that was predicting a Russian invasion. So how have things panned out compared to what you thought was going to take place in Ukraine?
Well, I thought at the time that the Russians would go in, as you point out, and obviously that's happened. I don't know how anyone could have concluded anything else. We've been pushing them for years, and I think the last 8 years has made it clear to them they didn't have any choice if they were going to protect what they think are their security interests in Ukraine. I think if we look at the initial intervention, a couple of things were very obvious. They were going to secure the eastern part of the country, that is, east of the Dnieper River, all the way out to the Russian border. They were going to move south to secure the water source for Crimea because the Ukrainians had gone in there and effectively cut off the fresh water that was pumped to Crimea from the mainland. And we wondered what they would do in the northern part of the eastern Ukraine. And many of us concluded that there would not be a serious effort to seize Kiev or Kiev. It's just too big. It's really not necessary for their purposes. And so we concluded, I did, and a lot of people that I trust, that they would put forces in and around Kiev just to tie down the Ukrainian forces there so that they couldn't interfere with what happened further east and further south. I think that's occurred. There may have been an attempt to move into Kiev, but that may have simply been a reconnaissance of force to see how far they could get. But I don't think there was a serious plan to take that city. It's huge. And again, if you're only going to secure the area that is east of the river, remember most of the city is on the west side. About a third of the city is on the east side. And finally, they wanted to move into those areas they knew were friendly to them, which meant they didn't want to be tied down in areas where they knew they were going to run into stiff Ukrainian resistance. I think they got about 50 to 60% of what they wanted. I think they were an army without a lot of military experience in the field fighting anyone, which is true for almost all of us these days. Any army in the West that you send anywhere has seen very little action. That was true of us, by the way, in 1991 when we went in. And you always have mistakes. You find out things that you didn't know about your own force. You see things you would have done differently. That was true for us in 1991. So I think right now what's happened is that everyone is seizing on some feature of this to justify their position, whether it's anti-Russian or pro-Ukrainian or anti-Ukrainian and pro-Russian. I'm an American. I'm not interested in being involved in this war. I don't think that we should involve ourselves in any way. I think waging a proxy war, which is what we're doing right now, by feeding the fires in Ukraine is very dangerous. Especially since Ukraine sits right next door to Russia. This is not Vietnam, where the Russians could supply some things to North Vietnam or to North Korea, but we were both remote from our respective countries. This is a proxy war that's very dangerous because it sits right on the border with Russia. And as far as the alleged atrocities go, we've had a lot of those allegedly committed by Ukrainians. Americans haven't seen the videotapes, haven't seen the photographs because we suppress that information in the West about the Ukrainians. Now we've seen something allegedly committed by the Russians. This may actually have been something a group of Russian soldiers committed. We don't know. And this is the problem. We tend to act on emotion, not rationality. And now I run into people frequently that say, we have to punish the Russians. Well, that's interesting. As world policemen, we're going to punish the Russians. Well, then we might as well punish the Somalis. We might as well punish the Mexicans. We could punish lots of people. Makes no sense whatsoever. We don't know the facts, but we do know that we have two groups of people fighting right now that hate each other. That's pretty obvious. And the best thing we can do is try to bring an end to it, which has been my argument from the beginning. Mm-hmm. The president of the United States should use his influence not to postpone an end to the war, not to lengthen it, not to make it worse, but to bring it to a close, because the longer it goes on, the more potentially dangerous it becomes for us. Because for Russia, this is an existential matter. This is next door. What happens in Ukraine is critical to them. They don't want a foreign government running the show in Ukraine. They don't want us running the show in Ukraine. They want a government there that's preferably Ukrainian, but not hostile to them. Mm-hmm. They don't want foreign forces on Ukrainian soil that threaten them. They don't want foreign missiles on Ukrainian soil that puts missiles within a few minutes of flight time from their nuclear deterrent. These are all issues for them. From our standpoint, this is not existential. And I think people have made a mistake. They think, well, we can fight this war to the last Ukrainian and bleed the Russians and make them miserable and harm them. I think it's going to backfire. I think it actually already has on the international level, but that's something we can talk about.
Yeah, you bring up a bunch of great points there. One I want to go a little bit deeper into is the fact that Russia does see this as an existential threat, though some, American political commentators might disagree with that. They really don't know the boots that Russians are in right now. You would have to understand the history between Ukraine, Russia, NATO, these great powers. I'm curious your thoughts on who is currently in charge of Ukrainian-U.S. relations and, the drive to continue the war, the U.S. proxy war in Ukraine at the moment, because as we all know, George Soros has set up his foundation many years ago, decades ago, before Ukraine was even a sovereign state in the country. And he played a great role in the Euromaidan coup in 2014. We know that there's leaked cables from 2008 with William Burns admitting that they were attempting to put pressure on Russia by creating a civil war in eastern Ukraine. And we know that Victoria Nuland and Jeffrey Piot are two of the main ideological pushers of having Ukraine serve as a vassal state to put pressure on Russia. So who do you think is really in control, if anyone, of Ukraine policy in the White House right now?
Well, I don't think the Ukrainians, per se, are in control of what's happening in Kiev for Kiev any more than most Americans are in control of what's happening in Washington. And there are 2 points that I'd like to make. The first one is that whenever you have such unanimity in the American and Western media, and you have such brilliant timing, such that a piece of news comes out like what you mentioned earlier that's happened in Bucha, it comes out and there's this enormous explosion. It's almost volcanic of hate and criticism and stories supporting all of this against the Russians that bursts on the scene almost immediately, all at roughly the same time. And all of the retired general officers come on and with no exceptions say virtually all the same thing. And when that happens, I step back and I'm extremely suspicious and very skeptical because I've seen this before. I saw it in the run-up to the Iraq War back in 2002 and 2003. I saw it in the Balkans with regard to what happened in Bosnia and then subsequently in Kosovo. So it looks like we have a similar strategy now. And the second part of this information campaign, which is very sophisticated, that's being run, I think, largely by us in the West, primarily Washington, maybe MI6 in London, is certainly not the creature of people sitting in Kiev or Kiev. I don't think that's the case at all. But they are clearly responding to this. We're working hand in glove with them. How much of it is us? How much of it is them? I think it's mostly us. And I think we have someone in the form of Mr. Zelensky who really satisfies our requirement to bleed the Russians. Unfortunately, he's bleeding Ukraine and Ukrainians. And that's the bad news. Now, we know that Nuland and Blinken, Secretary of State Blinken, listens very carefully to Victoria Nuland. She's been a key player from the very beginning. I'm sure she still is. And these are dedicated Russia haters. They really are. It's very strange. I haven't seen anything like this that I can recall since perhaps the early 60s, maybe the 50s, when we suddenly realized that we'd been hoodwinked in World War II and turned half the world over to Stalin. There were a lot of people then who were extremely suspicious and reacted appropriately. And now we're seeing something that's similar to that, only we're not dealing with communism. Russia is not remotely communist. Russia is a capitalist state. People say, well, it's fascist, which means essentially authoritarian. There are various forms of it. Well, most of the world, frankly speaking, is run by authoritarian regimes. But why Russia is now the center and the object of so much hate and so much attention and so much violence from the West is really a mystery to me, because I don't see it as falling in the same class as, say, Stalin and Stalinist Russia, which deserved to be hated and despised and feared and ultimately attacked far more than anything happening today in Moscow. So beyond that, I can't tell you much more than you already know.
Could it be that this new multipolar world that we are making our way into, and I think has really been this process of multipolarity, it's really been exacerbated throughout this whole current conflict, the economic war, the decline of the petrodollar, the rise of BRIC nations? You know, could it be that this is what really pose the greatest threat to the West and why they decided to embark in this mission? And I mean, what are your thoughts on that? And do you think that this actually caused the whole system of U.S. global hegemony to kind of implode?
Well, I think we're the authors of our own destruction, frankly. I wouldn't attribute or give that credit to somebody like Putin in Moscow by any stretch of the imagination. But you know, to come to your point, I just finished writing something that will be published tomorrow in the American Conservative that effectively addresses this. And if you understand that Russia is not leaving Ukraine, that's number one. They're not withdrawing. They're not going to pull up stakes and leave. Then you have to understand that they will not lose in Ukraine. Suggesting that the Russians will lose in Ukraine is tantamount to suggesting that if we intervened in northern Mexico, that we would lose in Mexico. No, we're not going to lose in Mexico. We can't. They can't, because we're near everything. In other words, our airfields, our ports, our logistics, our intelligence, everything sits in close proximity to Mexico. If we decide to go in there, we're going to do pretty much whatever we want and stay as long as we like. I think that's the case for Russia and eastern Ukraine. Now, initially, the goals were neutralize the Ukrainian state so that there are no foreign forces, foreign weapons, and so forth. Secondly, grant autonomy or independence, whatever you want to call it, to the two Russian provinces, Donetsk and Lugansk in the east, who are Russian and don't want to forcibly be Ukrainianized. And by the way, there are a lot of people like that in eastern Ukraine. And then lastly, Crimea. Renounce any claim to Crimea, because the whole thing is ahistorical. It's never been Ukrainian.
Correct.
It's been Russian since 1776. And before that, the Mongols and Tartars ran it for hundreds of years. Perhaps we should give them a hearing and let the Tartars come back along with the Mongols and decide if they want to get Crimea back from the Russians. But the Ukrainians, forget it. That's nonsense. So those were the minimal requirements. But this has gone on so long. The Ukrainians have been so utterly stubborn, at least the ones that represent Zelensky, and I think to a large extent because of us. You mentioned Soros. I'm sure he has an influence. But I think we have seen this as an opportunity to bring NATO together, or so we think, and then hammer the Russians over the head by pushing the Ukrainian fight against Russia. Now, I think that's going to backfire. And you pointed to some things that have already begun. First of all, I don't see any evidence that these sanctions are going to work for any length of time. Countries are already bypassing them. And then if you look at the really big players out there, China, as long as the border with Russia is secure and the Chinese support the Russians, the Chinese can absorb virtually all the oil, gas, minerals, metals, food in abundance that Russia produces. And the Chinese certainly aren't going to encourage the Russians to, commit suicide in order to make us happy, because they probably assume that if the Russians go down, it's only a matter of time until we try to organize something to destroy them. So I think the Chinese are in this for the long haul. And after all, they're the second biggest economy in the world. And then you have Japan, sits right offshore. The Japanese have said, oh, yes, of course, we support you 100%. However, we are going to continue to buy oil and gas from the Russians. And oh, by the way, we have joint projects with them north of Japan in the Kuril Islands and in the Northern Pacific. And we're going to continue running those joint operations. Well, Japan is the third largest or second largest economy. I mean, take your pick. Then you have the Germans, and the Germans have never been comfortable with this. The Germans have not felt threatened by the Russians, and with good reason. The Russian military is simply too small to threaten Europe. There's no evidence that the Russians want to do anything other than business with Western Europe. The Germans are huge partners for the Russians. They've only now just become the biggest partners for China in Europe. So when you look at the Germans, how long can the Germans live without Russian oil, gas, food, and so forth? The Germans just announced the other day that they're going to start rationing food products. Good Lord. Is Germany at war? I don't think so. And how long will that go? How well will that go down with the German population? They're saying they're going to pay into this Gazprom operation and have their money turned into rubles in order to pay for the gas. We'll see how long that goes. But I don't see the Italians being very excited over this, and they're the next largest consumer of these Russian products. Then you have to look at the Netherlands and Belgium, even the Czech Republic, Austria, Hungary, even though Austria is not NATO. All of these states have much more at risk in this whole proposition than we do. Remember that the only reason we're miserable right now dealing with gas problems is because of Mr. Biden and his administration, who decided it was in the interests of the world that the United States stop being the number one energy producer. So we're suffering unnecessarily and probably will continue to do so under him. But we've also got serious problems now in agriculture because we're not getting the fertilizer we need. And there are a whole number of products associated with petroleum that are produced in this country that are vital, not just to agriculture, but to so many other things. So we've shot ourselves in the foot. And then, of course, we printed all of this money. Russia does not have this odious debt that we do. And they're now tying the ruble to gold. Imagine that, going back to a gold standard. Well, that could do us in very quickly, as you know. I mean, we went off this thing for a reason so that we could print money and do as we like. And then you pointed out the petrodollar. Here are our friends in Saudi Arabia, the people that Donald Trump worked so hard to bring together with the Israelis, the Arab Peninsular Arabs. And they're now saying, well, we may do business in yuan. So where does the petrodollar go? What does that mean long term for the dollar as reserve currency? Our economy is very fragile. It's not robust. This is not 1939, 40, 41, when we started to come out of the Depression, go into the war. We had all of this skilled labor ready to go back to work. Plus, we had a manufacturing base. We don't have it. We had it again in the early 1980s when Reagan was president. We could put the manufacturing base back into operation. What have we got? Our manufacturing base is somewhere overseas, China, Malaysia, Southeast Asia. We don't have it. It hasn't been repatriated. And since Biden became president, he made it very clear he has no intention of repatriating it. And simultaneously, how many millions of people have we let into the country about whom we know nothing? They're not only unvetted, we can't assimilate them, we can't employ them. what's going to happen to those people once things here become scarce. Scarcity changes things. We're a nation that has enjoyed abundance since the 1940s. What happens when scarcity replaces abundance? Then people start to look around and start saying, wait a minute, where are you from? And why are we feeding you?
Mm-hmm.
These are bad things. No one in Washington has thought through anything. It's just astonishing. There is no strategy. Everything is impulse and emotion, no reason or rationality.
I 100% agree with you. Yeah. One character you mentioned earlier was Zelensky. I don't even know what to make of this guy. We saw him do an interview with Fareed Zakaria on CNN about a week ago, in which he said that NATO, presumably the United States, had told him some time ago that Ukraine was never going to join their alliance, but publicly the doors were to remain open, maybe to provoke Russia, to pressure Russia, to make them fear a potential Ukrainian membership. I don't know. And I just don't understand why a man would take his own country to war, use them as cannon fodder in a sense, for this mission if he knew that he was never going to be able to join NATO. And in addition to that, we also saw a recent, a note from German Chancellor Scholz. He admitted that at the Munich Security Conference that he had a conversation with Zelensky and pressured him to guarantee Ukraine to neutrality. And Zelensky said he wouldn't. So what do you make of this? Zelensky's celebrated as a hero in the liberal press. I'm curious what your thoughts are on him and how he has handled this situation, or if he's really had any control over the situation at all.
Well, before we talk about the comedian drag queen who's now become president of Ukraine, which is a story for the ages, frankly. I mean, Hollywood couldn't make this stuff up. It's unbelievable. We ought to stop and go back to Scholz, because Scholz is a tragic figure in my judgment. Mm-hmm. Because in many ways, when he speaks, he's speaking for most Europeans. Mm-hmm. And the Europeans haven't figured out that this is driven largely from Washington, what's going on in Ukraine. We've been pushing this envelope for a long time, and it's not in Europe's interest. European interests have not figured prominently in our calculus. All we've done is look carefully at what damage we could do to Russia. Now, that did not happen with President Trump. There were people in his administration, like Pompeo and others, who were very much committed to the same things as Blinken and company. That's a whole nother story. But I can tell you from personal experience with President Trump, he was hard over in his opposition to war, period. He thought that was the dumbest thing that we could possibly do. And unless somebody attacked us directly, he wasn't interested in it. And he particularly saw Russia in a different light, as a potential, not necessarily ally, but certainly as a partner under the right circumstances. Mm-hmm. Saw no reason for violence or hostility towards Russia. And that was helpful, but unfortunately, it was a brief pause. And the underlying drift in the direction of hostility and confrontation continued. And I think now the danger is, the longer this lasts, the greater the possibility is that something terrible will happen to us. And the Europeans, I think, are beginning to figure this out, because this existential issue for Russia in Ukraine becomes more existential every time we involve ourselves with Zelensky, send him more equipment, more support, and urge him to stonewall and fight it out. And the question is, how long do the Russians go before they finally present us with an ultimatum or potentially strike back at us? I don't know. That's why proxy wars are so dangerous, because the proxy is not under control. Who is controlling Zelensky? Do we really control him? Are there other people in Ukraine controlling him? I've had people tell me that there's very little he can do, because if he does anything his backers don't like, he'll be stood up against the wall and shot. I mean, he's got Ukrainians that are very radicalized. Mm-hmm. And we've seen plenty of evidence for that in this place called Mariupol and elsewhere, where they have shot people that refused to fight, where they wouldn't let civilians leave areas, because they knew that if they let the civilians leave, that the Russians then would take the gloves off and come in after them. You know, we've been listening over and over and over, well, the Russians hit these buildings and hit this hospital and so forth. Well, if you put your artillery in the hospital, chances are it's going to become a legitimate target. Same thing's true in these urban areas where they've had ambushes and killed Russian troops that came in there initially not firing, then had to fall back and then turn those buildings to the extent they could, isolate the enemy and take them under fire. So all of this begins to build, and eventually there's a meeting in the Kremlin with the general staff and with Mr. Putin, and they say, how much longer do we put up with this? Do we utterly level the entire border with Poland to make it clear that we'd rather have a desert there than allow anything else to come in from Poland? And how close does that bring us to conflict, direct conflict with Russia? And how rapidly will that escalate to the nuclear level?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'd like it to stop. So you're asking all the right questions. None of us really knows those answers unless they're on the inside. And the people on the inside in this administration aren't really telling us the truth about much of anything.
Exactly. You mentioned the fact that earlier on you said that there's no chance that Russia essentially doesn't come out victorious over Ukraine if it's, the two parties that continue to fight and that's it. Given that, and given the fact that what we seem to be witnessing from the Russian military, again, we don't have the Russian playbook before us right now, we're just speculating, but it seems as though the Russian military has just been applying enough pressure to keep massive troops protecting Kiev, Ukrainian troops protecting Kiev, while the Russian military fulfills their goals in the outskirts of Ukraine, doing their denazification, demilitarization, removing NATO weaponry, these sorts of things. I'm curious then, given today's events, an alleged massacre, 410 civilians they're reporting, at least, they're said to be dead in the city of Bucha in Ukraine.
Bucha,
yeah. So what do you think about this? Do you think it would make sense for the Russian military, who spent a month occupying that city, living, in relative peace with the civilians there, to kill 410 civilians on the last day as they leave the city? Or do you think that there might be some questions that should be raised about this?
Well, no, I don't. And I think experience in military affairs suggests that if you do that sort of thing, all you do is stiffen resistance against you.
Mm-hmm.
The bodies don't disappear. The act persists. It has a bad odor. It doesn't go away. And it's hard for me to believe that this was a deliberate act by the Russian military. That said, it's not impossible. We did things in Vietnam that were terrible. We know about some of them. We don't know about all of them. Soldiers on the battlefield, if they're frustrated and angry, if they're drinking a lot of alcohol, using drugs, any number of things, they can suddenly run amok and do terrible things.
Mm-hmm.
Again, I looked at both sides of this, and I couldn't come away with a certain conclusion one way or the other. There were things that didn't make a lot of sense. A lot of these people had this white armband tied around them. The white armband was a signal to the Russian army that, look, I'm not part of the Ukrainian army. I don't support it. Effectively, I'm not in the war. And all of a sudden, large numbers of those people are dead. We do know that Ukrainian forces have killed people like that elsewhere. They've assassinated mayors, people have disappeared, and so forth. But again, I'm not saying that happened. I don't know. And my experience in the Balkans, when I was involved with the air campaign, and then earlier in Bosnia in '95, the Finns were a very good source of investigative scientists, medical people. They would get in and they could tell you the truth. And what the Finns told you, you could believe. But the two sides involved rarely. And I'm not putting much trust in what either side says right now in Ukraine. I was looking at all the figures that are being supplied to people about all the equipment that supposedly the Ukrainians have destroyed. It sort of reminded me of the last election, when more people voted than are registered to vote in the United States. If you believe all of these figures, I think you wiped out a substantial portion of both armies in terms of the figures. I don't buy it. I'm just very skeptical of all these things. Mm-hmm. And right now you have masses of troops surrounding this Ukrainian mass that remains in southern Ukraine. How will that turn out? I don't know, but I would suspect that the Russians can probably annihilate it. How they will do it is it's up to them. In 1944, when the Russians cut off and surrounded 50,000 German troops in what we today call White Russia near Minsk. They backed off, they surrounded it, and they brought in air power, 5,000 aircraft. And most of the German troops in the field could not break out because they were surrounded by armor, and they were killed. I guess we could see something like that happen. The Russians can do it, and now they have much more accurate munitions in many cases that they haven't used a lot of, but they could use down in southern Ukraine. I don't know. I think we're going to have to wait for events to dictate the outcome. But I really think this war will end when Putin decides to end it, not at any other point in time. And right now, he sees no reason to end it, given the attitude that he's encountered at the negotiating table.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of the negotiating table, we know that, figures within the U.S. deep state have invested loads of resources, money, time, energy into creating a Ukrainian vassal state. I mean, they helped lead a coup against the, albeit slimy and corrupt, but democratically elected leader in Ukraine in 2014. I'm curious what you think about the Biden administration and more specifically the Biden family. As this Hunter Biden laptop story begins to make its way out into the press, we're beginning to see a lot of corruption that is on full display from the Biden family, Hunter Biden, presumably Joe Biden, that took place between themselves and business ventures in Ukraine. Do you think that this is significantly muddying the water and creating a foggy environment and maybe even making people like Joe Biden act a bit unhinged and acting more with, his pocketbook than his brain when it comes to bringing about a reasonable solution to the current war in Ukraine through diplomatic means, negotiations?
Well, as a general proposition, I must tell you that I have the impression that most of the political leaders in Washington on the Hill tend to think of themselves as largely immune to prosecution for almost anything. And they have all sorts of insider deals for themselves regarding everything from medical care to stock investment that go on all the time. And it all seems to happen beyond the pale, if you will, of what is right or what is wrong under the law. I don't know. And I think it was this Congressman Cawthorn, maybe his name, from North Carolina, in the wheelchair, who detailed to people that he'd been brought to something that was effectively an orgy or whatever. And I wasn't really surprised. This kind of thing has always tended to fester in these political cesspools over centuries, but you try to hold it in check to prevent it from overwhelming the system and overwhelming the government. When the government is overwhelmed by this sort of thing, you get 3rd and 4th century Rome, total decadence, decay, and collapse. I hope we're not there. But the whole Biden family saga is so distressing when you see some of these photos that come off this laptop, assuming that what we're being shown is real. It's frightening, because I think in most cases, most Americans would conclude that people engaged in that sort of thing should be subject to the harshest penalties possible under the law. But nothing seems to happen. And more important, the media do not seem to be involved. There are a few, but very, very few. And anybody who speaks out is sort of like, well, what are you, a Putin agent? Why? Because I don't want to go to war? Because I'm not interested in joining the Ukrainian fascist league or something?
Yeah.
No, I'm not interested. I'm an American. I don't want to go to war in Ukraine. There's no vital strategic interest that drives our interest in that place. The only interest we should have is to bring it to an end and negotiate an end to it. That much I agree with. The rest of it, no. But if you don't go along right now, you are immediately sort of tarred and feathered with all the usual epithets, accused of, racist, bigot, all this nonsense. This seems to be the standard procedure, but the louder that gets and the more you hear it, the more convinced I am that the whole structure is very weak. This government is not strong. If it were strong, why would they react in those ways? Why would people in Washington behave that way and react in those very defensive ways towards anybody who disagrees with them. So I think we're in a lot of trouble here in the United States, to be blunt. And I don't give a damn at this stage what happens overseas. I care much more about what's happening here. And if we're not careful, the people in Washington are going to wake up and discover that there are a lot of Americans out there who are no longer willing to take it, no longer willing to sit and show up and behave like the sheeple that they are accustomed to. That's much more serious to me than anything happening in Ukraine. But to your point, what is not possible today in Washington? And I think that's the answer to your question about the Biden family.
Yeah. I think we have time for maybe one more question, and it's not necessarily related to Ukraine, but given that you are a former, or you're a U.S. Army colonel, former U.S. Army colonel, and a senior Pentagon advisor to the Secretary of Defense under the Trump administration, I'm curious, you're a real patriot. You speak about these wars in a way that I think reflects the interests of most Americans. We should concern ourselves where necessary and avoid war at all costs if we can. Given that, how difficult was the power struggle within a presidential administration like Trump's, where the man ran on a lot of these anti-war, points and policies? But we know publicly, at least, there have been people within these positions who have, positions like the Syrian envoy, for example, James Jeffries, who've admitted to directly violating Trump's orders and keeping troops where they were not supposed to be kept. I'm curious, just personally, what was your own struggle between these factions within the administration? And was it disappointing to you? Was it shocking, or did you expect this?
Well, the point on Jeffries is critical, because it's beyond just keeping troops where they weren't supposed to be. People actively lied to the president about where the soldiers were or were not. So it got to the point where what came back from the Pentagon was not trustworthy. And I think, President Trump was a person who came to Washington without a lot of political experience. And I think he had notions about people in uniform, senior officers, that were simply false. He thought that if he called in someone that had 4 stars on their shoulders, that he was talking to somebody like MacArthur or Eisenhower, or Arnold, any number of people, and that these people were going to tell him the truth, and they were going to do what was in the interest of the country, and they were going to obey orders. And if they couldn't, they would be honest men and say, "I can't do that, and I'm going to have to resign." It took him far too long to figure out that that was not the case. Let's be blunt. So that's the first thing. The second thing is that when Eisenhower was leaving the White House and he bade farewell for the last time to Kennedy, and they saw each other again because of the disaster in the Bay of Pigs in Cuba. But prior to that, when he left, Kennedy said, "Do you have any final advice, parting advice?" He said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Be a good butcher." And JFK looked at him and said, "What?" He said, "Be a good butcher. If you're going to be an effective commander-in-chief, an effective president, you've got to be prepared to go after people and fire them, get rid of them, even destroy them if necessary, in order to hold the administration accountable, hold it together, and ensure that people are doing what you've told them to do." And he said, if you can't do that, that's all right. Find someone else, put them in the White House and make them your designated butcher. But you've got to do that. Donald Trump didn't fit that. He's one of the nicest persons you will meet. People that see him publicly, they don't necessarily appreciate what a really nice, sincere human being he is. And I think he gave too many people too many opportunities, too much benefit of the doubt too often. Now, if he comes back, maybe that'll change. I hope so. But that is the lesson that you take away from the presidency. And by the way, Clinton was very good at handling those sorts of things. More than one 4-star went away within 24 hours when he ran afoul of the president of the United States. And we need a lot of that right now for the reasons that you've already cited.
Very, very interesting. Colonel Douglas Macgregor, thank you so much for coming on the show. Thank you for making time. And yeah, we're going to keep following your work and your commentary on all of this. And just before you leave, is there anywhere people can, I know you've got a website, you've got several books that you've written. Is there anywhere where people should follow along with your work?
Well, I've got a website and there's a YouTube channel that somebody set up. The last book I wrote is worth reading. You know, you can do what most West Point cadets do when you buy it and read the introduction and the last chapter and call it quits. But I think a lot of people would find the book interesting. It's called Margin of Victory, and it tries to explain some of the larger issues that spell the difference between victory and defeat. And it's a little different from what you're going to read in most books, because military establishments are successful not because of something necessarily that happens exclusively on the day of battle. They are successful because of what's happened over decades. And that's something we don't understand very well. We think we spend money, we bought military capability. We spend a lot of money, we don't have what we think we're buying.
Well, I look forward to grabbing that and reading through it. So thank you so much again for coming on, and hopefully we can speak again sometime soon.
Thank you very much.
All right. Have a good day. Thanks for watching that episode of The Dive. If you'd like to support independent journalism, be sure to subscribe and consider becoming a member on my Patreon using the link below.